At this point in history, most Catholics are familiar with or celebrate the Mass of Pope Paul VI, sometimes referred to as the Novus Ordo or the New Mass. So Steve and I thought it'd be good to do a two-part video on the New Mass. And today's video, we're going to do 5 things every Catholic should know about the New Mass.
Point 1 is that it is not the Mass of Vatican II. It's not the Vatican II Mass. A lot of people will think that like Vatican II came up with a Mass.
Yeah, the council itself.
Right. The council, all it did was called for a reform of the current Mass. And it listed some things that it would like to see, right? But the Mass of Paul VI is something that happens after the council.
Right.
This is a response to that call of Vatican II. And there were a lot of different calls for it. I mean, there were a lot of different interpretations of what this should look like. And the Mass of Pope Paul VI is just one among many interpretations of what that is.
And that's significant because when people come to look at that Mass and assess it and critique it, that's valid.
Yeah.
Right? That's valid to do because it is not something that a council put together itself. This was something that we thought this is our interpretation of the council.
Yeah, and certainly if the men who came up with the Mass of Paul VI could critique the old Mass, the Mass of the ages, certainly we're perfectly within our rights to critique or assess the current Mass.
Okay. Point two concerns rubrics, right? So in the New Mass, the rubrics, and by rubrics we mean kind of the rituals, what you do in Mass, right? What the people say, what the priest should say, what the priest should do at certain moments, the rules of how you celebrate the Mass. In the Novus Ordo or the New Mass, the rubrics are, well, not there.
I was going to say
there's a lot less rubrics, and the rubrics that are there can sometimes be very ambiguous. And that's important to note because that means there's space in the Mass for the priest to make a decision. And when priests have to make a decision, that means they have the ability to insert their own personality
and piety
into the Mass. That's a good point. Their own personality and their own piety into the Mass, which is why sometimes you get clown masses or folk masses or whatever you have had down through the last few decades in church.
And that can bug you, when a priest is, inserting his own personality. But there's even a flip side to that. There's a greater danger that you can become too attached to a priest. I mean, I remember growing up, there were people in the older generation that were saying things like,
"That's our priest dog inserting himself into our video."
Somebody get that dog some rubrics.
So go ahead with your point.
You hear it all the time, like from some of the older generation say, "Oh, I go there. Oh, I love that priest. I love the way he does stuff." And it's like in the old Mass, that's not a thing, right?
Yeah, well, that's kind of troublesome too. In the old Mass, the rubrics are really tight, and there is no room for that. And that's because the old Mass doesn't want to focus in on the priest; it wants to focus in on Christ Himself.
Yeah. So point 3 would be that the New Mass is not a one-to-one translation of the old Mass. I think a lot of people. I've actually been shocked.
I did when I was growing up. When you hear about Latin Mass, it used to be in Latin. Your parents would say, and I thought, okay, well, the English one's just the English version.
Yeah, and actually, it's not at all. However, if you do want to see a translation of the old Mass, all you have to do is go to your local Latin Mass, open up the Missal, and usually on the right side of the page, there's going to literally be an English translation. In fact, it gets kind of awkward because sometimes
I love that translation.
Yeah, sometimes I'm at like a Latin Mass and like I'm looking at it, I'm reading it, I'm thinking like, why isn't that the Mass? Right. Why didn't they just translate it?
Yeah, if the point was to get it into the vernacular, into the
so that people could engage. Yeah. So it's very strange. But if you wanted to see what it would look like, just pick up a Latin Mass like Missal, and you'll be able to see. The New Mass is completely different. I mean, the only thing that is the same is like this kernel.
I was going to say the one-to-one, the Roman Rite, the Eucharistic prayer, Rite 1, is a translation of the old Roman Eucharistic prayer.
So basically, when you come to that point when the priest is saying the actual Eucharistic prayers, now in the New Mass, there's actually 4 options.
Yeah, you got 2, 3, and 4, which were made up. Well, they were theologians in a room got together and wrote up some liturgies for you, which is very not usual in the history of the church.
Yeah, in the history of the church, the liturgy, whether it's East or West, the liturgy sort of grows organically over time, and you have sort of reformations. Sure, there have been reformations where they'll take out like a part that is not necessary, or they'll add something that is pious.
I remember even Pope Gregory writes to the Angles, right? The English. in the 7th century saying, well, take what is useful.
Yeah, that already exists.
Yeah, that
and
already
add it.
exists, and bring it into the Mass to make it even more.
Or bring them both together, right?
To make it more excellent.
But the point is that you work with what is already existing. You don't scrap it and write something new,
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
So that doesn't really happen in the history of the church, and the reason is because you also don't know what is super ancient and what is later.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right? So you don't really know, like, well, this could be a part that actually did come from the apostles, because you lose track of that over time, right?
Yeah.
So there's kernels of the liturgy throughout, where parts of the liturgy where you say, that is from the apostles.
That's part of it. We don't know how old the Mass is.
Yeah. So you have to be careful with that. And that never happened in the history of the church where somebody just writes a new Mass. Which brings us to point 4.
Point 4.
That there was a time. There was a time.
Tricked you.
When somebody did sit down to write a new Mass. And it was during the English Protestant Reformation.
Zing.
Yeah. The man's name was Thomas Cranmer, okay? Crafty Cranmer. Why was Cranmer so crafty?
Well, he was crafty. We've mentioned that principle before of lex orandi, lex credendi, right? The law of prayer is the law of belief. So he felt like, well, I'm not going to go at this thing with doctrine right away. I'm not going to change it, right? Luther or Calvin, they went at doctrine right away. But Cranmer knew that if I want to change the belief of the English, I'm going to go at the liturgy.
Yeah.
I'm going to translate the liturgy. And every translation is really an interpretation.
Yeah.
Right? So in his translation, he's making interpretations in his new Mass that he creates.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me, we'll just say some of the things that he brought into the Mass, and maybe people will blush because it sounds familiar to people. One of the things is the Mass ought to have simpler vestments, right? We're going to get rid of the marble altar. We're going to have an altar table. We're going to celebrate the Eucharist in the round, with everybody gathered in the round. We're not going to say the Mass ad orientem, toward the east. We're going to say it from the north, actually, of the table.
So the people can see.
Right. And then, of course, it's in the vernacular. It's in English. So
lots of signs of the crosses were removed.
Yeah.
The rood screens in the churches were taken down. The huge, beautiful altar pieces, a lot of those were destroyed.
Everything was simplified. Yeah,
Everything was simplified. Yeah. Exactly. And the whole idea became the focus is this is a communal meal of the church rather than a communing in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross.
Right.
So the Mass of Pope Paul VI conspicuously looks a lot like some of the reforms of Thomas Cranmer.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So that brings us to point number 5, right? Because when you look at what happened in the 16th century, people bled to give us the old Mass. People bled to give us the Mass of the ages because they didn't like what Cranmer was up to. They knew what he was up to, right? And people like St. Thomas More, right? St. John Fisher. They literally went to their deaths to preserve the Mass. So I always just kind of get the goosebumps myself, like when I'm thinking about when the new Mass of Pope Paul VI was actually being like written and drafted. It just makes me wonder, like, what St. Thomas More or St. John Fisher, they would have been thinking, like, what in the world did I die for?
Yeah, why am I in this prison right now? If that was going to happen anyway.
Yeah, like if you're already going to, take down the altar, simplify the vestments, and get rid of the quiet prayers and all these things, and you weren't even going to directly translate the Mass from the Latin to the English, but just completely draft a new Mass. I mean, it makes you wonder what they died for.
Yeah. So I think in the final analysis, as a family, can we assess what was done in Pope Paul VI Mass? Is it in continuity with what came before it, our ancient fathers and all of that? But also, is it in continuity with Vatican II?
And what Vatican II was calling for.
And what Vatican II was calling for in the Mass.